Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. My name is Dan Jennis. I'm the Acting Education and Programming Coordinator at the Huron County Museum and Historic Jail. This presentation is being put on in honor of Veterans Week, and yesterday was Indigenous Veterans Day, which honors the estimated 12,000 Indigenous veterans of the First and Second World Wars and the Korean War. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that what is now called Huron County is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. We recognize the First Peoples' continued stewardship of this land and water, and that this territory was subject to the dish with one spoon wampum, under which multiple nations agreed to care for the land and water and resources by the Great Lakes in peace. We'd also like to acknowledge and recognize the Upper Canada treaties signed in regards to this land, which include Treaty 29 and Treaty 45.5, and our roles as treaty people committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation, gratitude, and respect with all First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. If you have not been to Huron County Museum in a while, our military gallery highlighting local history is open. And right now on our north lawn, our Sherman tank has been draped with over 3,000 crocheted poppies, a project led by our local IODE to commemorate their 120th anniversary, as well as the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Legion's adoption of the poppy as Canada's symbol of remembrance. So that was that picture a minute ago. I'd like to thank our guest, Alex Fitzgerald-Black, for being here tonight. Alex is the Executive Director at the Juno Beach Center Association, the charity that owns and operates Canada's Second World War Museum on the D-Day landing beaches in Normandy, France. Before I turn it over to Alex, I do have to go over a few technical items. This is a Zoom webinar, so everyone's cameras and microphones are off. No one can see or hear you. But if anyone has any questions, including technical problems, please type them into the chat, which I will be monitoring. The format of this talk is approximately 40 minutes of presentation followed by a question and answer period. And as I said, you can type your questions at any time during the presentation or after it into the chat. So I'll be keeping track of those questions to give to Alex at the end. The last thing I wanted to mention is that the weakest link of a virtual event is the internet connection. So if the screen keeps freezing, try exiting and re-entering the webinar. And if the problem is on our end, we'll do our best to quickly resolve the issue. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alex. Thank you.
Perfect, Dan. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this chat today. I'm just going to share my screen here and get my presentation going. Actually, let me redo that. I always forget the first time to click the Optimize for Video Clip button, and that is what I'm going to do. And I need to switch these. There we go. All right, everybody can see that okay, I hope. Dan, thank you so much for inviting the Juno Beach Center Association to speak to you and your audience today about the D-Day story. Our Juno Beach Center Museum in Normandy, Canada's only Second World War museum in Europe. Just by way of introduction, the Juno Beach Center Association is the Canadian not-for-profit charitable corporation that exists here in Canada. Our office is actually based in Burlington, Ontario. And as Dan said, we own and operate the museum overseas and help secure much of the funding for it. There's a lovely image of the museum I can't remember if that's dawn or dusk, but a beautiful image of the museum near Courseulles-sur-Mer, Normandy. So just a little outline of this presentation, kind of 4 parts. First, I'm going to outline Canada's participation on D-Day and during the Battle of Normandy, mostly at a high level, but I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll also explore the reasons and circumstances behind the creation of the Juno Beach Center and how it came to be. I'll introduce everybody to the Juno Beach Center itself and how we can honor our veterans there. And then lastly, I'll give a brief outline of our plans for the future and perhaps some information about how Canadians can support this sacred piece of Canada in France. So starting with the history, always good to start with context. Basically, I want to review the events of kind of 1944 with you. So to catch everybody up, Canada entered the Second World War on September 10th, 1939. And our participation in the war was a massive effort both overseas and on the home front. There were 1.5 approximately million men and women who aided and served in both Europe and at home. 1.1 million Canadians served in the armed forces during the Second World War. And by the spring of 1944, Germany had occupied France and much of the European continent, and they'd been there for the better part of 4 years. Obviously, there were pretty heavy battles going on the Eastern Front, and you can see on this map that the Allies have kind of worked their way halfway up the boot of Italy. But at the end of the day, the only way that the Western Allies, the Americans, the British, the Canadians, and their allies could win the war against Nazi Germany was to invade somewhere on the continent, probably in France, and defeat the German armed forces. So that leads us to D-Day and the Battle of Normandy. I think most of you are going to be aware of what D-Day was, but it was the largest combined military operation in history, and that combined piece is very important. A lot of people say, it was the largest invasion in military history, or it was the largest operation. It depends on what and how you're counting, but in terms of combined air, land, and sea, it was the largest in history. So it involved over 11,500 aircraft, almost 7,000 ships and landing craft, 133,000 seaborne troops, 156,000 troops overall. And of those figures, just over between 14 and 15,000 were Canadian. If you include both the seaborne troops who landed at Juno Beach and the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion that landed in Landon. I'll show you where that was in a moment. D-Day succeeded at the end, not to spoil anything, but it worked. But there was no guarantee, even with all that support, even with all of those aircraft, all of those ships and warships and landing craft, and the tanks that were landed ashore that day, there was no guarantee that D-Day would succeed, and perhaps nothing better than General Dwight Eisenhower's comments. Eisenhower was the overall commander for the operation, and he wrote this on June 5th, 1944, quote, "Our landings in the Cherbourg, Le Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." And so he wrote this on the eve of D-Day, and you can actually see on the bottom right there, he actually wrote July 5th on the document, which eventually, after D-Day was successful, he meant to throw away, but one of his aides preserved it. And maybe that indicates, just how perhaps nervous or distracted he was, while writing that note. He wrote the wrong date by a complete month. But the point of this note is, even General Eisenhower, who was, had complete knowledge of all the planning and effort and all the deception operations and everything that went into D-Day, he still, with all that information, did think that there was a chance that it could fail, and was ready to, stand up and, say, hey, it was on me. You can also see, maybe if you're good at reading handwriting here, where he's actually scratched some words out here. He originally wrote, "The troops have been withdrawn." And for the editors among you, you'll recognize that as passive voice. He changed it to say that I have withdrawn the troops. I made the decision to do that. And so he was really taking ownership of whatever the result would be. So where was D-Day? Well, D-Day occurred with land forces sailing from bases along the southern coast of England. Most important of these bases being the Portsmouth area here, and that's where the Canadians came from. This is a really neat map because it shows you where all of the Allied divisions were kind of echeloned and prepared for D-Day. And you can see all of their routes that they took to the continent, to Normandy, and all the different beaches there. You've got Area Z, where everything is kind of organized and the Armada gathers. You can see 3rd Canadian Infantry Division here, just north of Portsmouth. That's where they were getting ready for D-Day. And you can also see the 2nd Canadian Corps, the 2nd Canadian Corps being a higher level formation over here in Kent. And that's actually kind of interesting and important because 2nd Canadian Corps actually formed a significant part of a deception operation that tried to convince the Germans that the main landings were going to occur at the Pas de Calais over here, as opposed to Normandy down here. So here's an overview of where the landings occurred more specifically. So you have the US airborne forces landing on the western flank, connecting what you'll see as Utah and Omaha beaches. You have the British 6th Airborne Division landing on the eastern flank, which includes the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, about 500 or 600 men from Canadians involved there. And their job in particular was to, there's the Orne River here, and there's also the Caen Canal along here. Their job, among other things, was to destroy bridges and also capture certain bridges in that area to control the flow of reinforcements across that flank. Because, as you'll see in a second, this is where the landings are taking place. You have the Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword beaches, and then the Canadians between those two British beaches at Juno Beach, centered in the map here on Courseulles-sur-Mer, which is the site of the Juno Beach Center. Here's a more detailed look at the Canadian landings. So this map shows 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and its landings at Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, with various regiments of the 7th and 8th Brigades forming the assault troops. You've also got the 9th Brigade with the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment in reserve. And you also have supporting units of the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, like the 1st Hussars from London, Ontario, or the Fort Garry Horse from Winnipeg, that are coming ashore in Sherman tanks, many of which are duplex drive tanks, that are actually floating tanks, trying to give support on D-Day. You can also see where the Juno Beach Center exists today on that map as well. And you can see on this map, basically the lines of advance on the first day for D-Day. The Canadians had an objective here, which was known as, I believe this will be the Elm Line. This was a intermediary objective off this map, and I'll show it in a second here. Down here you have the Oak Line, and that was the original objective of the Canadians on D-Day. And you can see where the front line was on the night of June 6th, 7th. Here, just in, at their Elm objective line. And you can see where the front line was a night later, where about half of the Canadians had gotten to their original D-Day objective and half of them had not. But there's good reason for that. The Canadians were actually ordered to halt on this line after the first night by their corps commander, who was a British general at the time. I think he made a sensible decision because you have a German counterattack actually going in between the beaches that day. And so it made sense to kind of stop and consolidate. And then down here on the 7th of June, there was a big encounter battle between elements of the 9th Brigade, including the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment, and the 12th SS and elements of the 21st Panzer Division as well. A big encounter battle where in the old literature, it kind of was written as the Germans had kind of pushed the Canadians back a little bit. In reality, I think it was more of a draw, this battle. And it certainly stopped the Germans from getting anywhere close to the beaches and anything like that. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. There's a great book called Stopping the Panzers by Canadian historian Mark Milner that goes into that in great detail. So that's some lovely images here. These are color images, original color images, not colorized. You'll see a lot of colorized images these days of various elements of the Canadian division landing at Juno Beach on D-Day. So this is Bernières-sur-Mer at the center of the Canadian landing area on June 6th. You can see there's a landing craft assault in the foreground here. Behind that is a landing craft tank, and there's actually some Sherman tanks on the deck there. They're going ashore. You can see barrage balloons. This is the church steeple in Bernières-sur-Mer, and there's a whole bunch of activity going on behind. Another photo of Bernières-sur-Mer, but from a different perspective. This photograph shows kind of the afternoon when the tide has now gone out on D-Day, and the reserve battalions are coming ashore slowly but surely in the afternoon there. Also have this oblique aerial reconnaissance photograph from June 6th, and this is Courseulles-sur-Mer, which is actually the site. Today, the Juno Beach Center sits just about right here, smack dab in the middle of the image. And this is an image of Courseulles-sur-Mer during the landings on D-Day. You can see on the right here, there are some landing craft offshore, and they delivered, troops and vehicles to the beach. And most of the vehicles seem to be going to the right, and they're probably looking for a way off the beach, one of the beach exits or something like that. A little note on Canada on D-Day, the commitment and the cost. So overall, there were 21,000 troops that landed on Juno Beach. 14,000 of those were Canadian, and about 7,000 were British, so about a 2-to-1 ratio there. The Royal Canadian Air Force also had 39 Canadian squadrons committed. Those squadrons lost about 7 aircraft, and there were 22 airmen killed. Many of those airmen were actually serving not just in the Canadian squadrons, but in British Imperial squadrons, RAF squadrons. The Royal Canadian Navy had 61 major warships, anything from kind of a minesweeper to a landing ship to a destroyer, active on D-Day and supporting the landings in some capacity. We had the second most major warships there on D-Day among the Allied countries, including the Americans. The British had the most, Canadians had the second most, and we're often lopped in with the British. The Americans, they had plenty of warships there too, and many very large warships like battleships and cruisers, but they didn't actually have quite as many major warships as we did in terms of numbers. Canadians crewed 46 landing craft. There were 17 motor torpedo boats as well. We don't actually have any fatal casualties for the Royal Canadian Navy on D-Day. It doesn't seem like there are any based on our research, but there were certainly several wounded, especially among the men who were operating the landing crafts, bringing the forces ashore. As I noted earlier, there was the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. About 550 paratroopers jumped on D-Day. 19 of them were killed and 10 were wounded, and then 84 were captured on D-Day. So that gets us to some totals. Total cost to Canada for D-Day is approximately 381 killed, close to 600 wounded, and 131 captured. So this was one of the deadliest days of Canada's Second World War. Obviously, it didn't surpass Dieppe, but it was perhaps a close, not a close second, but it was one of the highest days after Dieppe. And Dieppe, of course, was something like 800 Canadians killed on that day, and perhaps another 100 more killed, died of wounds, or died in prisoner of war camps and that sort of thing. So it was, D-Day for Canada was a great day. There was a lot of valor, we take a lot of pride in what the Canadians did, but it was also a very tragic day for the lives lost. And perhaps nothing brings this home better than the new D-Day Heritage Minute, which I will share with the group. Dan, let me know if for some reason the sound doesn't come through, but I think I have all my settings enabled the right way.
They were just kids from New Brunswick. Never even left the North Shore before. Dad trained them the best he could. But how could they possibly be prepared? This was the biggest operation the world had ever seen. He'd already served in the First World War, earned the right to stay home, raise his children. But how could he send those boys into battle and not be by their side? Many were killed that day. One was my father.
Major Archie McNaughton was 47 when he died on D-Day, the invasion that marked the beginning of the end of the Second World War.
There we are. So I also have some personal reflections to share with you from some of the veterans of this battle. Hugh Buckley, who was a loader gunner in a Sherman, or not a Sherman tank, a Stuart light tank. Here he said, the Arrowhead was Canadian. I think the reason was because every Canadian soldier there was a volunteer. And that was absolutely true. There were conscripts who were used by the Canadian Army later in the war, but for D-Day, all the Canadian soldiers there, all the airmen, all the naval personnel, they were all volunteers. Garth Webb, our founder, the founder of the Juno Beach Center, said it was like the Stanley Cup and the Grey Cup and the World Series all played the same day, and I'm not only there, but I'm playing. He was a big sports fan, and that was how he tried to explain his experience. And Lockie Fulton, who was a company commander with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, I believe, he wrote, June 6, 1944 is a day that will forever remain in the memories of those who survived. I'm going to catch everybody up on how the Battle of Normandy ended. It ended in 76 days. Interestingly enough, the Allies had planned that it would take maybe 90 days. So they actually beat their estimate on this, but it was quite a deadly battle. 2 German armies were destroyed in the course of this battle, or the better part of them, with the combat power of nearly 40 divisions. German casualties are estimated anywhere between 300 and 450,000. And Allied casualties, somewhere around 230,000, including airmen. The Canadian share of that was 18,700 casualties. That's killed, wounded, or missing, or captured. And of that number, nearly 5,500, if you include the airmen as well, are buried in Normandy or were killed in Normandy. And that's quite a massive number. 45,000 Canadians killed during the Second World War. This was a campaign that, again, lasted just 76 days. The number 5,500 Canadians killed is comparable to the number killed in the entirety of the Italian campaign. So this was a very bloody time for Canada. After the Battle of Normandy concluded, the German army was in, pretty much full retreat, headed back towards their own borders. And this is the route that the Canadian Army, with the 1st Canadian Army, with 2nd Canadian Corps, and also 1st British Corps, took after the Battle of Normandy. So the Battle of Normandy is occurring kind of down here in this image. And then the breakout occurs, and this is called the Great Swan, where the Allies advanced almost unimpeded for the better part of a month. And the Canadians were responsible for liberating places like Dieppe. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division got there. We had to, there's kind of siege warfare at this point, where the Canadians had to kind of isolate and capture Boulogne and Calais. Dunkirk was cordoned off. I don't think they captured Dunkirk until the war ended in 1945. Sometimes it just wasn't worth attacking the German garrison there, but rather just keep them bottled up. And then the Canadians end up, for the remainder of the war, moving into Belgium and the Netherlands and into Germany, and liberating the former 2 countries and I guess conquering parts of northern Germany. But the reason I show this to you is because I'm going to transition here from the history to kind of more of the modern content. And I have this clip from Matthew Halton, who was a CBC senior war correspondent during the war. And this is a clip from our podcast series, which you can find online. It's called Juno Beach and Beyond, and it's a clip from the CBC archives. And Matthew Halton in this clip kind of really speaks to kind of both the meaning of Remembrance Day, as well as, asking us, what are you going to do? How are you going to remember? And I'll just let that play.
But as I stood at Vimy Ridge before going on through the darkling plain toward Belgium, my thoughts went back to Normandy, to that road from Caen to Falaise. And if there were ghosts round Vimy Ridge as we swept past that day, I wonder if they were saying something like this. Listen, what are you going to do after this war? Perhaps you're going to build a memorial twice as high as this one on the road from Caen to Falaise to commemorate our sons, the dead and damned battalions, the Black Watch and the North Nova Scotias and the rest. Arras, Bapaume, Ypres and Vimy Ridge. That was the anthem of the doomed youth of one generation. Bretteville, Caen, Tilly and Falaise, that's the anthem for the doomed youth of another. We died, Our sons died. What are you going to do?
And that question, what are you going to do, is something that concerned a number of veterans in the 90s, including Garth Webb, our founder. The Juno Beach Center exists as it does today due to the way Canadians remembered, or even perhaps failed to remember, the Second World War through to the 1990s. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And I would really recommend Tim Cook, historian Tim Cook's book, The Fight for History, if you want to get into those in detail. But there's, a number of reasons. Things like, this war, unlike the First World War, perhaps, was not a very contested event. Everybody agreed there was a good cause and that, we had to be victorious against the Nazis. They were bad. We needed to rid the world of them. The veterans, they went on, they created, new lives for themselves. And they perhaps didn't, think about the war nearly as much until perhaps they retired in the 80s and 90s. There's also, the common question, should we be building memorials or spending money on veterans? But really, it was in the mid-1990s that Canadians woke up to our Second World War veterans and what Canada did during the Second World War. And a big part of that was the 50th anniversary celebrations in Europe, the 50th anniversary of D-Day and Juno Beach, and the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War and the liberation of the Netherlands. And, the media covered those events quite extensively in Canada. And I think those events, and Tim Cook says this in his book, they really made people sit up and understand and realize what their fathers and mothers and other veterans had gone through at the time. In the 1990s, Garth Webb, he landed on D-Day with C Troop of the 14th Field Regiment, Royal Canadian Artillery, and his regiment, his unit suffered many casualties that day. And they went back, him and his 14th Field Regiment, they went back in 1994 for an anniversary tour. And they were kind of stunned that there was hardly anything at Juno Beach that really explained what Canada had done during the Second World War and what Canada had done on Juno Beach. Sure, there were plenty of individual regimental memorials, honoring the fallen from various regiments that went through the area. But there was nothing that told the story and actually educated a new generation about what had happened. And so their vision became to create a memorial that could pass the torch to younger generations. And so they worked very hard to raise money to make this museum a reality. So the museum was founded by veterans and volunteers as a permanent memorial and education center dedicated to Canada's contribution in the Second World War. Garth Webb and his partners, his fellow veterans, they raised around $10 million in Canada and France. And the museum finally opened in June of 2003, 1 year before the 60th anniversary of D-Day, 1 year to prepare. So a little bit about the museum. We're located on the very site where the Canadians landed on June 6, 1944. But our mandate goes well beyond telling the story of Canadians on D-Day. The museum pays homage to the nearly 45,000 Canadians who died during the Second World War. But at the same time, it also showcases Canada today, allowing visitors from all over the world to learn more about Canadian values and culture. And you'll see this lovely quote from Tim Cook on the right-hand side of the slide here about how the Juno Beach Center has become a place to remind the world that Canada fought alongside Britain and the United States at the sharp end of the liberation of the oppressed peoples of Europe. Some guiding principles behind the museum. It's a sacred piece of Canada in France that's open and accessible to all. It's a place of education, especially for youth. We have a youth circuit at the museum that is a specific kind of guided, self-guided tour for youth and activities for youth throughout. It's a place of discovery, reflection, and emotion. And it's a museum and center that we hope Canadians are proud of and that helps Europeans better understand Canada's contributions to the Second World War. With COVID-19 being a factor, our number one audience right now, of course, as it is always, is French people, but followed by people from especially Belgium and the Netherlands as well. And so it serves as kind of an informal embassy for Canada in that way. It's also a place for Canadians to gather, to remember, and to give thanks. And so we've, had the honor of welcoming veterans for the last almost 2 decades, both Canadian veterans and British veterans who landed at Juno Beach, for them to share their stories and for them to commemorate and celebrate the D-Day landings and the liberation of France together on major anniversaries, usually every 5 years or so. These photos, I believe, are from the anniversary in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, on the left. A few numbers. So we've had over 1 million visitors to the Juno Beach Center since June of 2003, and more than 10,000 school groups since the same time. We had over 100,000 visitors in 2019, which is a huge milestone for us, but obviously the pandemic has limited things in the last year and a half. Approximately a quarter of our visitors are Canadian in a non-COVID year. And, the COVID-19 impact has been significant. We've had to be, closed for big parts of the year, as I'm sure the Huron County Museum has experienced. And obviously, physical distancing and other measures mean that we can only have so many people at the museum at any given time. And our tour groups tend to be smaller and that sort of thing. So not as many visitors in recent years, but we're really hoping, the COVID-19 situation kind of resolves itself or gets close to that next year, and that we can really begin to start welcoming Canadians in particular back. Let's share this little video, a little trailer of the museum to give you a sense of what the museum looks like on the outside as well as in. So I hope that gives you a good idea of what you expect to experience at the Juno Beach Center. One of the things that opened in the last, 2014, it's over 5 years ago now, is the Atlantic Wall defenses that have been excavated outside of the museum. Volunteers dug out 20 tons of sand to unveil these bunkers and to make them accessible in time for the 70th anniversary of D-Day, which was in 2014. And we're hoping to conduct further research into the German use of these positions and how Canadian troops overcame these positions as funds allow in the future. But this is really a highlight of a tour for anybody who visits the museum. It's part of our kind of Juno Park tour at the museum. So you can tour the museum itself and also the park that exists at Juno Beach around it. You'll note in those videos, we really highlight our student guide program. And this was an important component of what the veterans wanted for the museum when they founded it back in the early 2000s. It was really important for them, for Canadians to be greeted in particular, but for anyone to be greeted in particular by a Canadian, especially someone, a younger Canadian, someone who was perhaps the age of many of the soldiers who volunteered, served, and perhaps died on D-Day and in the Battle of Normandy and in the Second World War. So we hire 8 to 10 guides each year. Right now we're hoping to hire around 6 for 2022. Actually, that hiring is ongoing now. So definitely check out the website if you're interested. And we've hired more than 150 young Canadians and given them this opportunity to gain work experience in France since the museum opened. There are a couple of, you need to be kind of a student or a recent graduate, so not just a student, to apply for the program. And you also need to have, maybe not be completely fluently bilingual, but you need to have a good working knowledge of French and be able to speak it and communicate in French verbally to help with our visitors, of course. Year-round programming, this is part of the reason why the guides are so important, because they bring the Canadian cultural aspect to the museum. So, things like Halloween, we actually have, Christmas celebrations, of course, Canada Day. We have an Acadian ceremony in August every year to interest and to educate local French audiences, in particular, about the various cultural attributes of Canada and what Canadians experience here on kind of a regular yearly basis. And that's really where the guides kind of help us out, because of course, most of the staff at the museum, there are some Canadians on the permanent staff, but many of the staff are French, and so they really bring that aspect. As I said, 2019 was a huge year for us. 100,000 visitors, and we were chosen, the Juno Beach was chosen as the site of both the Canadian D-Day anniversary ceremony and the international D-Day ceremony. And we were fortunate enough to welcome about 40 Second World War D-Day veterans to the museum that day. You can see many images of them towards the bottom of this, and this image here, one of the veterans alongside a guide there. And that may be the last time we have that many veterans on site at one time. The next major anniversary, 2024, I'm sure we'll be back there. And we'll probably have some veterans, especially some British veterans. It's usually easier for them to travel. But hopefully we'll have some Canadian veterans too, but I suspect we will not have such a large contingent again. And so that's something we will, continue to look out for, and hopefully, we're always so honored when one of our veterans can join us there. So it's been now 18 years, and we're a private nonprofit museum. We're supported through entrance fees, the guided tours, the boutique sales, all of which are much reduced due to COVID-19. We have the commemorative brick program, which you may have seen in those in that trailer, and other special campaigns. We now have a flag sponsorship program that I can chat about in a second. We also receive significant funding every year from the Government of Canada through Veterans Affairs Canada that helps with the guide program, educational programming, museum upgrades, and also we've received some special COVID support, very generous of the Canadian government to support us with that. And of course, we couldn't do anything without our generous support from Canadian donors. So we always appreciate anyone who can contribute. Now we'll move into kind of some of our future plans. One of the things the museum is embarking on is in a big way, is sustainable development and an expansion of our footprint. Obviously, COVID has limited our guests, but our museum was originally built kind of with, maybe 50, 60,000 visitors a year in mind. And now, in a non-COVID year, we're hitting upwards of 100,000. And so we need to expand to meet that demand. But we want to do so in a sustainable way that reduces our overall carbon footprint. And so this initiative requires investments in our existing and in new infrastructure. The museum staff in France have actually secured nearly $4 million in funding from French and European governments to support the initiative. And we need Canadian support to secure the additional $1.7 million to fully fund the initiative. And that's something we're starting to work on now. Really, our goal, the museum's goal in particular, is to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero effectively by 2050. I think our goal is basically 5% reduction per year. And that's in pre-COVID years, of course, because during COVID, our carbon footprint has been reduced just based on the reduced number of visitors and the reduced operations. We also need to have a major upgrade to room G, which is the final room in the museum. It's called Faces of Canada Today. And this is one of, again, the strengths of the museum is bringing Canada to the world at an incredible intersection of history and the present cultures and the relationship that exists between the liberators, our veterans, and those they liberated, the French people. But unfortunately, this exhibit does date from 2003, and it's in dire need of a transformation to reflect Canada's modern veterans in 21st century Canada. For instance, there is nothing in the exhibit about the war in Afghanistan because the war in Afghanistan was still in its early years at the time. We're hoping to have a grand opening for the 80th anniversary of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy in 2024. And this is going to be the crown jewel of our sustainable development and expansion initiative. And so we're looking for support from Canadians. We're also looking for support from Veterans Affairs Canada for this particular project. So how can you help? We've got a few programs that I'll very briefly go over. We have our commemorative brick program where people can make a donation in order to honor maybe a family member or a loved one. Could be a Second World War veteran, could be a First World War veteran. Most of our bricks are Second World War veterans, but we don't limit anything at all. I believe all of the Afghanistan war dead have a brick at the museum. And it's a touching way for Canadians to honor someone, maybe from their family or community. And many Canadian schools research soldiers and pay tribute to them with a brick at the Juno Beach Center, especially if they plan for a visit to the museum. And so they can kind of do a little brick unveiling and be part of that commemoration in that way. We also have the flag sponsorship program that I alluded to. This is a new program. COVID-19 meant that, few Canadians could make it overseas to actually see the bricks and maybe be inspired to purchase one. But what we're doing with this program is actually bringing a piece of Juno Beach Center to Canadians. So the museum flies the maple leaf every single day, and in order to make sure that they're in very good condition, we often have to replace them. And so we thought, why not offer these flags to Canadians? And so that's a new donor program, and you can check that out on our website for Canadians to kind of own a piece of Juno Beach in that way. If you're ever planning a trip to Normandy or to Juno Beach, please get in touch with us and let us know. We can offer, information, tips, and recommendations. And we're happy to help to make sure that you have a memorable and evocative experience at Canada's sites of historical importance in France. Whether it's a brick unveiling or something like that, we're happy to connect you with the staff in France and support you in that way. The last thing I'll leave you with, it's another little video. It's about 2 minutes long. This is a trailer for our upcoming From Dieppe to Juno exhibit. And I want to preface this by saying there is some, it's not all that disturbing, but there is some disturbing. It's got old newsreel footage and that sort of thing in it. And it includes some wounded Canadians and some dead bodies and that sort of thing. So if there's any children watching or parents watching with children, you may want to, have them avert their eyes for this portion. But I do think it's a very powerful trailer and that you'll enjoy it. So here I go. And that exhibition, it's going to start in March of 2022 and run through at least December 2023. So if you want to start planning your trip, you still have that window. It's a temporary exhibition, usually lasts about 2 years, may get extended into 2024. We will see what our curators have planned. That's it for me. If anybody has any questions, I'm absolutely thrilled to answer them. And thank you for listening to me for the last 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat. And we will ask, but I'm going to start by asking, you mentioned the German bunkers that you partially uncovered, but what were the German defenses like at Juno Beach?
So Juno Beach was quite heavily defended on D-Day. Actually, the museum itself, the site that it exists on, was a German strong point, and that's what those bunkers, were part of. So it was a very heavily defended area with mines, barbed wire, machine guns, mortar positions, what have you. Fairly lightly manned, I guess, in general, but they had force multipliers in terms of the amount of firepower that they had allotted to them and their defensive positions, obviously. The Allies threw everything they could at the defenses, aerial bombardment, artillery from the sea, offshore bombardment from warships, but most of it, didn't actually work. The bombs fell too far inland. The artillery didn't provide, maybe it provided a little bit of suppression, but it ultimately couldn't really breach any of those, strong points or anything like that. So it was really the bravery of the soldiers, coming ashore and storming those defenses that turned the day. And even the tanks, the duplex drive tanks, that were providing direct fire support. In many cases, they were late or weren't in the right position at the right time. And so the infantry had to do that themselves with, perhaps some help from the engineers and that sort of thing. So yeah, quite a daunting series of positions that the Germans had to defend the beach.
Another question I had is, Huron County's key connection to the Second World War was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, where the British and Canadian Air Forces trained in Canada, safe from enemy attacks. And Huron County had 4 air training bases: Sky Harbor in Goderich, Port Albert, Centralia near Exeter, and Clinton in what is now Vanastra. But what was the Royal Canadian Air Force's impact on the Battle of Normandy?
So the Canadian Air Force was, they were present, kind of throughout the Commonwealth Air Forces. So there's kind of two trails. Like once you finish going through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan and you're assigned overseas, you could either end up in a Royal Canadian Air Force squadron, and as I said, about 39 of those squadrons were participating in the Battle of Normandy, or you could end up in a Imperial squadron or a British squadron. And throughout the war, about 60% of Canadian airmen served in a non-Canadian unit at one time or another. So during the course of their service, they served in a British squadron at one time or another. By 1944, by kind of May, June 1944, that number was perhaps closer to like maybe 50%. And so Canadians were present in Transport Command, they were present in Bomber Command, Coastal Command, and Fighter Command in particular. Transport Command, responsible for delivering the troops on D-Day, for flying out casualties later in the Battle of Normandy from captured airfields. Bomber Command was responsible for providing some close air support in terms of direct bombing of enemy troops. Also, the Canadian Air Force and the British Air Force Bomber Command bombed a number of German coastal defenses, not the ones directly in front of Juno Beach, but rather the larger gun positions, kind of on the flanks of the invasion. They also attacked a lot of railway and other logistical nodes in France, unfortunately killing a lot of French civilians in the process in doing that. Fighter Command, the Canadians, interesting little story about the Canadians in Fighter Command. It wasn't called Fighter Command in 1944. It was called the 2nd Tactical Air Force. And then there was also what was called the Air Defense of Great Britain, which was essentially fighter command. And the Tactical Air Force had two groups. One was number 83 group and the other was 84 group. Interestingly enough, in the planning for D-Day, 83 group was originally tasked with being there on D-Day with 2nd British Army. So the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was part of 2nd British Army for the D-Day landings and for the early part of the Battle of Normandy. Eventually, 1st Canadian Army comes ashore and then takes over command, but 2nd British Army is the starting formation. And so 83 Group, which was composed primarily but not exclusively of Canadian squadrons, they actually had a choice to make. They were asked, do you want to, because 83 Group, a group would be assigned to an army. So 83 Group was originally assigned to 2nd British Army, 84 Group was assigned to 1st Canadian Army, and 84 Group was more of an international group. And they asked 83 Group, do you want to be part of 1st Canadian Army and support them directly, during the Liberation campaign? And they came back and said, well, if we do that, we have to give up our spot for D-Day of being kind of the first formation in. We don't want to do that. And so as a result, the Canadian Air Force was not necessarily later in Normandy and then in Northwest Europe directly in support of the Canadians, but rather in support of British forces. So it's a little interesting kind of turn of history that way, which also makes historians' jobs a little more difficult down the road to kind of tell an integrated story, because the Canadians were supporting the British, not the Canadian Army.
A question from Eric asking, was the 19th Field Regiment in this fight?
Yes, so the 19th Field Regiment was a field artillery regiment, and it was actually a 1st Canadian Army unit. And so it was originally attached to 1st Canadian Army. What they did for D-Day, or it might have been 2nd Canadian Corps, but either way, it wasn't normally attached to 3rd Division. 3rd Division, one of the things that the planners realized is that Juno Beach, the land from Juno Beach is prime tank country, or at least country that the Germans would probably want to capture and use to advance to the beaches for their counterattack, which would feature armored formations. And so what they did is they gave the Canadians, the Canadian Division, extra firepower. They gave them extra units like the 19th Field Artillery Regiment. Normally an infantry division has 3 field regiments. They were given the 19th Field Regiment, and I believe also a British Field Regiment in addition to that, to supplement their order of battle, to give them more firepower, so that when the German counterattack came, they would be able to kind of smash it. And that's effectively what happened over 3 or 4 days of fighting on D-Day and afterwards. And so the 19th Field Regiment was absolutely in the fight, and they played a critical role in making sure that the Germans could not push the Allies back into the sea.
A question I often get is, why Normandy? Why was that spot chosen for the landings?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people you look at a map, and some people, I mean, even at the time, they said, the most direct route to Germany is elsewhere, right? It's perhaps through Calais or one of the other kind of channel port areas. One thing is, there's a whole bunch of criteria for selecting a landing site. One was perhaps not to land in the most heavily defended area and the area where the Germans thought you might come, and that was Calais. Another is you need to be within range of land-based fighter cover. And so if you were to, understand what the ranges of various aircraft were and draw a circle from the bases in the UK, Normandy fits that bill. Normandy also has some very good beaches, as you can, see from some of the images I shared with you for landing. And it was also quite close to the port of Cherbourg, which was a major port. Now, the Allies did not capture that port intact by any means, though they hoped they might be able to. And so it was also kind of hoped that if you could capture an area where it was close to a port, that would get you, help you with your logistics down the road. And of course, the Allies also brought their own, they were called mulberry harbors, essentially. The mulberries, they brought 2 artificial ports with them, one of which was destroyed shortly after D-Day, only a couple of weeks really after D-Day. But there was a second one, and that did quite important work through the rest of the campaign. Medical aid. The next question is about medical aid stations. So the medical system was fairly complicated, not in a bad way, but it was fairly built up at this point. So you'd have the infantry battalions would have what were called regimental aid posts, and they would be just a short distance back from the front line, and that's where the wounded from a particular unit would typically be collected. Beyond that, you'd have what were called field ambulances, and their job was to both transport casualties and to take care of them in kind of field dressing stations and that sort of thing. But they actually had quite a significant, as the Normandy campaign got going, they had quite a significant medical system set up. And around the Bayeux area, which is kind of right smack in the middle of the beachhead, they had some pretty a big concentration of hospital facilities. That's actually one of the reasons why there are two major Canadian war cemeteries in Lower Normandy. One is at Benny-sur-Mer, which is just inland. The other is at Bretteville-sur-Lez, which is between Caen and Falaise, two of the major towns in the province. But there's also a bunch of Canadians buried at Bayeux, and part of the reason they're buried there is because the hospital facilities were based out of Bayeux. The other side of it is the medical facilities were also, especially specialists, were also back in the UK. And so, like I said earlier, with Transport Command and what the transport aircraft were doing, once the airfields were secure, they would actually fly in, pick up casualties, and take them back to Europe, to England for further treatment. And some of the first Canadian women to participate in the Battle of Normandy were nurses who came in July of 1944 to help work that hospital system as well. There were RCAF, Air Force nurses, as well as Army nurses.
All right. If there's no more questions, I'll say thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and for taking part. And thank you very much, Alex, for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Everyone have a great night. Thanks.